everyone. I'm Ben Cairns, Director of the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. Thanks for coming today. We've been pretty delighted and in fact slightly overwhelmed by the response to today's webinar. I think if nothing else, it suggests that the tide may be turning towards unrestricted funding. So that in itself is very exciting. I'm going to kick us off with a brief overview. Then each of the four speakers will share their perspective on unrestricted funding for about 5 minutes or so, and we'll then have time to take questions, we hope, for about 20 minutes. So please do post them in the Q&A, and if we don't get to respond, we'll endeavour to follow up after today. And we are recording part of today, so we will also circulate the link. So before I say my little bit about the research, I want to introduce our four speakers. We'll hear first from Edmund Kung, who's Executive Director of Sport for Health. And it's great to have you with us today, Edmund. And Edmund will be followed by three contributors to our research. And I'd like to thank them and their colleagues for agreeing to speak on the record, which is not a normal thing, and to do so openly and thoughtfully. And thanks also to my fellow authors, Liz, Richard, and Kiva. So welcome to Rachel Oglethorpe, who's Director of the Peter Minet Trust. Rachel, it's great that you've joined. Thank you. And to Sufina Ahmad, Director of John Ellerman Foundation. Good to have you with us, Sufina. And finally, Rennie Fritchie, who's been Chair of Trustees of the Lloyds Bank Foundation of England and Wales for the last 7 years. Rennie, it's lovely to see you as well. So if the four of you now want to turn your video off and mute, I'll say a few words about the Holy Grail of funding. So why now for research about unrestricted funding? And for IVAR, indeed, why again? Because this is ground we've been ploughing for 20 years. Well, debates about how power, trust, and risk play out in the conventions and norms of grant making have been with us for many years. But the experience of the last 18 months has given them a new urgency. Throughout the pandemic, and looking forward into a complex and uncertain future, charity leaders have told us how desperately they need funders to give them greater control over their own spending if they are to remain adaptable and fleet of foot in meeting the needs of the communities and causes they serve. And many funders have discovered that the sky did not, in fact, fall in when they responded to the urgency of the moment by, for example, reducing reporting requirements and giving grantees the freedom to use the money as they, grantees, saw fit. Charities and many different types of foundations now share a growing appetite to make COVID-19 a transformational moment, a launching point for a relationship between funders and organizations that is fit for the future. One that's built on trust, openness, and respect for all their distinct expertise and know-how, and one that delivers greater social benefit rather than being overly concerned with control and compliance. A relationship in which foundations let go of the idea that they are best positioned to decide how change should happen, who is best positioned to lead that change, and perhaps even which outcomes are most important to prioritize. IVAR's open and trusting grant-making community of almost 90 trusts and foundations across the UK is committed to making this aspiration a reality. And charities and funders work together to design the 8 funding commitments at its heart. This report on unrestricted funding speaks to the commitment to enable flexibility. To quote directly, we will enable charities to respond flexibly to changing priorities and needs. We will give unrestricted funding, and if we can't or are a specialist funder, we will make our funding as flexible as possible. To support this effort towards greater flexibility, we asked a group of 12 funders to share their experience and what they've learned about funding in a way that enables flexibility. We were particularly keen to give a voice to trustees whose support is critical, but whose views are often assumed rather than heard in these debates. With annual grant spending ranging from 200,000 to 100 million, some of the funders we spoke to have a long experience of what we might call proper unrestricted funding, by which we mean no strings funding that funded organisations can use for anything within their charitable objects, while others are making their first steps towards a flexible approach. So what are some of the key messages? Well, this will be covered by our speakers, but I'd like to highlight 3 things before we move on. First, it's easy to miscommunicate in these debates because different people use different language in different ways. For example, many people use the term core funding as a synonym for unrestricted funding. But core funding is also used to describe a restricted grant for a defined element of overheads, for example, a manager's salary, and less commonly to describe grants to support established or core services rather than new projects and initiatives. Second, if we can put these complexities aside for the moment, at the heart of what the foundations in this report are all trying to do in different ways is to enable funded organisations to have greater control over their own spending. That's the key. And third, they're doing it because they believe that a more trusting and flexible approach to funding helps them to do a better job as funders, and it supports better outcomes for the causes and communities they care about. It really is simple as that. So I'm now going to hand over to Edmund. Thank you. Edmund, if you want to turn your video on and come off mute.
Firstly, I'd like to say how welcome it is to have this webinar, as it addresses a really important subject, and also to pay tribute to all those funders who are at the forefront of doing things differently. There is no doubt in my mind that there has always been an underlying relationship of power and subservience in a lot of funding ecosystem, where those with the money have the power, especially those with where funding is restricted, and those needing it have to dance to their tune. I hope this is changing and that many would like to see it change and are willing to make it happen. There are so many issues in society today that need fixing, and we can only do this by working together and supporting each other. I run a small organisation. We've been operating since 2006 with a typical income of around 50,000 a year. So I'm speaking from that perspective. I also sit on the grants panel for versus arthritis, so I have some experience of being on that side of the fence too. In common with hundreds of other organisations, our size dictates that we're totally reliant on applying for small grants all the time. Usually on a single year basis, there are very few multi-year funders for small organisations. Very few of these funders even consider funding for core costs or unrestricted funding, and hardly any small grants include true full cost recovery. Now, for me to raise around 50,000 from small grants, I would have to submit at least 20 applications and hope that 50% of them would be successful. Now in 2020, I made 48 applications, and currently this year I've already made 39. Now out of the 48 applications in 2020, I was only able to make 9 applications for core costs and or unrestricted funding. That's only around 20% of the total applications that I felt I could actually ask for core costs when the pandemic hit. Now out of those 9 applications, I just received funding for 2. So the success rate is very low, around 4%. Out of the 39 applications so far this year, only 6 have been possible for core funding, which is around a total of 15% of total applications. Now, these are the main points or barriers I feel that we need addressing. Now, as a small grants organization, we have to ensure that we are lean and efficient. So when making applications, it's almost for only direct costs. Hardly any will pay for my managing the project if it's successful. Actually, in fact, last week I was contacted by an assessor to justify why I had included time for monitoring reports in my applications. I just have to go along with this, as I just want to do what is intended to do in the charitable sector, and that's help those in need. This means, however, that again, I end up doing all the administration, monitoring reports, mid reports, final reports, data collection and analyses, all voluntary, which is unpaid. If I did include these costs, I feel that it could jeopardize my chances of being successful, so I usually leave them out. I feel all too often that funders do not recognize the true nature of small grassroots organizations, as they expect so much in return for such a small amount of money and a short time frame. And in both the application and monitoring reports, I feel that they always ask about sustainability. Now, if that's the case, if you are supporting project only costs, then how can you ask us to sustain the project after the grant has ended? In fact, by not giving us the flexibility to do what we need to do undermines our own sustainability. Also, small grants keep organizations small. They go against sustainability as they for short-term projects and do not cover the true costs involved and do not support continuity of services. So overly restrictive funding restricts our ability to do the best job, to be flexible and responsive. These are the last few points I'd like to see. First and foremost, small grants should be limited to small organizations with an income cap, perhaps, to the sums offered. That way, we see that you have made this distinction between smaller grassroots organizations like mine to larger charities with paid staff devoted to fundraising. As a grants panelist for Versus Arthritis, I see smaller grassroots organizations cost much more efficiently and provide the maximum impact of the grant to their intending participants, unlike the larger charities who are not specific enough actually in their costings, and often the grant funding requested ends up being absorbed by their general costings across the board. Please give us a level playing field in which we can compete for your funds. Show that you actually trust us. I raised some of the points in the recent 2027 conference and commented by funded during that discussion, oh, but we have to manage the risks involved. Well, why do smaller organizations always get treated as inherently more risky than the larger ones? Why do, is it because smaller groups are led by minority communities? Is there some sort of perceived discrimination at play here? Sometimes, even when a grant is awarded, there's a whiff of distrust, and that goes with it, asking for midterm reports and all the other copies of receipts, etc. I have seen through constant making applications that there seems to be more of a move amongst funders to support only those organizations with people with lived experiences as the majority of on their boards or staff. That is a good thing, but I have to ask, where is the lived experiences within the funders? How many of those accessing our applications and making decisions on them have ever had to do the applications themselves or have been responsible for keeping an organization going, for instance? I feel that funders don't reveal upfront what their monetary requirements be. So that would be midterm reports, final reporting, data collection. And I would ask every funder to look at their monitoring requirements and see them from a small organization's point of view, where we have to do all of this additional work unfunded. It would be great if funders would recognize this and allow some monies to be used for planning, say a percentage of range of total costs, for example. It would be so helpful if more funders were open to providing core costs and unrestricted funding, as small grassroots like myself need the financial help to manage and run our business, generate income, and actually keep afloat. I'm really pleased to hear that many funders are now considering offering unrestricted funding, even if it has to be qualified in some way, for instance. For those funders who are still unsure about going down this path, why not start off by making a few grants up to a certain value, say about £10,000 as unrestricted monies, and see how it goes there. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Thank you for listening. If you'd like my information, then I'm happy to pass that on, because obviously I've read it all out to keep to the time frame.
Thank you very much. You packed a lot of ideas and a few punches into that, and I'm sure we'll pick some of that up in the chat. Thank you very much. If you want to turn your up, I'm going to hand over to Rachel just to say quickly. People who joined on Eventbrite may have missed the intro, and apologies for that. We'll share the recording after the session, and it's great to have you with us now. And please use the Q&A function to share questions, and we will circulate all of the material, links, etc. afterwards. Edmund, thank you. Rachel, over to you, and I think you're going to have some slides.
Yes. Thank you. And we can move straight to the first slide. Thanks, Emily. I'm Rachel, and I run Minet Trust. I'll quickly take you through who we are giving, how we did, and some learning and challenges on the way. All place-based funder in Lambeth and Suffolk. We're independent. There's just me, one part-time director, days a week, and we can have up to 7 trustees. We distribute around £200,000 a year from our endowment. And we've moved from giving 50 small one-off grants of under £5,000. We changed in July 2019 to give us much smaller number of larger grants of around 30,000 a year for 3 years to small charities with incomes of under 300,000 a year. And this year we're prioritising Black-led charities. So moving on to the next slide. Why did we change? Well, there are two main reasons. Overwhelmingly, it was frustration. Our rejection levels were hitting around 80%. The time involved, we had no time to meet people. And to be honest, we really didn't know what difference we were making. We had new trustees on board who were also struggling to choose between the many different organisations. Second reason was in 2019, there was some really valuable research coming out, including from the Esme Fairbairn and Blagrave Trust, the Listening for Change, and Sufina's work at the City Bridge Trust on the strategic review, which was all published online. So implemented a strategic review. We commissioned some research into the value of our small grants with United St Saviour's charity, Rocket Science. And we also benefited hugely by new voices on our board who brought experience from the charity sector and a fundraiser. This led towards a really clear and energetic board commitment towards unrestricted funding, alongside some other improvements in our funding practices. So the next slide. Please, what have we learned so far? Well, charities have been telling us, made a huge difference for them in terms of being able to respond quickly to need. They've also told us, particularly during COVID, of course, that it greatly reduced their stress as organisations. Secondly, what I feel is that the time and skills, particularly as a small funder, are much better used. I can focus on relationship building and getting better at due diligence, whilst the charities can make the decisions that are right for them. They've also told us that unrestricted funding has really helped them leverage more funding. They've been able to take advantage of pots as they become available without having to check with us that we mind our grant being spent on something else. Now, the next slide is really the best way to illustrate. From Katie, who runs a fantastic youth project in Nunhead, Westminster House Youth Club. What she said recently was that the funding is truly unrestricted and we feel trusted to make the right decisions for our members. And then there's another slide which shares another reflection from Kat Fiona, who runs a small charity called Stepping Stones, which works alongside adults with severe learning difficulties in Southwark. And she said the unrestricted multi-year funding has given us security as well as flexibility. In 2020, we could respond immediately and redesign our service provisions. So finally, here are just some of our challenges as well as what we're doing to looking ahead. So we've just completed the process of renewing our first multi-year grants, and it's been going well. We've been learning a lot and we feel we are making more of a difference. However, looking ahead, particularly as a solo worker, I want to develop our learning in this area, learning about what red flags and how to manage those. And secondly, we're really mindful on, particularly with the Small Charities Fund, that this type of funding could lead to overdependence. So what we want to do is think about how we work with charities as the funding comes. Thirdly, as a place-based unrestricted funder, we actually only support charities who work only in Lambeth and Southwark. So we don't support charities who may be working next door in a neighbouring borough. This feels a bit uncomfortable, a bit untrusting, and we need to work out how we can adapt. And really, finally, we're really interested in understanding the difference unrestricted funding makes. We've got some great stories and great case studies, but we'd love to find a way of quantifying this more, and are keen to collaborate with other funders. So that's what I've got to say, and I can pass back to Ben, I think. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. And thank you also for flagging that set of challenges at the end. Some of which, of course, are addressed in the research. We will share your slides. I think you cut in and out a couple of times. So right. to anyone having audio issues, we'll share the slides. And Rachel is quoted frequently in the research as well. Thank you very much. We're going to go on now to you, Sufina.
Great, thank you. Thank you to IVAR for organising this event and for being a champion of core and unrestricted funding. I'm really pleased to be here today representing John Ellerman Foundation. For those of you that don't know us, we're a medium-sized grant maker and we support charities with a turnover of between 100,000 and 10 million. And we support charities that support our aim to advance well-being of people, society and the natural world. So we make grants to charities that are delivering nationally significant work in the arts, social action and the environment. We spend about 5.7 million annually, and our average grant size is around a total of £100,000 over 2 or 3 years. We've got a staff team of 6 and we're supported by 9 trustees. Our grants team is made up of 3 full-time staff and I work on grants for part of my time alongside my other duties as director. So our trustees are actively engaged in our grant making at both stages. So we run a 2-stage process generally. So at first stage, they work with us to select applications that best fit our criteria. And at second stage, they're involved in meeting our applicants digitally or in person. And then they take their recommendations to the board as to whether a grant should be made. So at Ellerman, I'd say we're a long established champion, if we can call it that, of core funding. It's very much enthusiastically supported by the team and the board. I think it very much speaks to our ambition to add value in whatever way we can as a grant maker. And we see that core funding is a straightforward way of doing that for us. It also resonates with our values. So 2 of our core values are to be responsive and flexible. Obviously, those things can mean many things, but in terms of our grant making, being flexible and responsive, a good way that any funder can do that is by offering grants for work that the applicant judges as most important rather than our own preconceptions. And so this results in applicants leading on defining how they want the funds to be used that they're seeking from us. So at the moment, 80% of our funding is towards core costs. Some applicants do request grants towards specific core costs, so that could be towards the salary of a particular post, and some do request project funding. And there are others that are happy to work with us on making the funding unrestricted in every sense of the word. So the flexibility that we offer in terms of having multiple forms of funding is a demonstration, we think, of our understanding that there are clearly benefits to having different kinds of approaches to how grant funding is distributed. So we are not a all or nothing kind of funder. We absolutely accept that there is room for different types and forms of funding. We just happen to prefer core funding. One of the things I wanted to reflect on briefly is that actually Ellerman is the first grant maker that I've ever worked for that offers core funding primarily. And one of the things that I've been really struck by is that there is a huge power differential or insecurity in the relationship between charities and funders. And I think that is getting in the way of a more flexible funding culture. So what I mean is, I think that it's fair to say that there is a bit of a prevailing culture of offering project funding within the grant making sector. And so one thing I've noticed since moving to Ellerman is the way in which applicants double, triple, quadruple check that we really are offering core funding. And it's like they're looking for the catch. Indeed, sometimes even when the grant's been made, we might hear from organisations asking us, how should we account for the funds that we've received and whether or not they should be assigning it to something. And I think that that speaks to these points of insecurity within the relationship between a funder and grantee. And it does speak to the fact that as a funder, we're often in a place of huge power and privilege. So one of the things we have been trying to do to try and address this issue is over the last couple of years, we've been reviewing our definition of core funding in an attempt to make it as clear as we can that core funding really isn't project funding in disguise and that it can be used for a huge range of overhead related activities and that you can specify what you want to use it for, or if that's not appropriate, you don't have to. And we've also been discussing in what circumstances we would offer unrestricted funding. And we try and keep that discussion very much live at an operational and a governance level. And we want to try and share what we're thinking as openly as we can do with applicants that are applying to us, because we do want the sector as a whole, but also our applicants to feel as confident as they can about seeking core and unrestricted funding from us. But I would say at the moment, our kind of happy space is core funding, often towards a defined element, but we are absolutely doing a lot more core funding where that definition of what it's being used for isn't as needed. And I'd say we are moving towards, you know, core and unrestricted funding becoming our norm. Thanks.
Sufina, thank you. And of course, you bring into Ellerman the experience of sitting on the other side of the desk in terms of thinking about the experience of applicants and the whole question of trust and power you raise, which hopefully we'll pick up in the discussion. Thank you very much for that. We're going now to finish our speakers with Rennie, who, as I said before, in case anyone missed introductions, has been chair of trustees for Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales for the last 7 years, and overseeing a fairly significant shift in funding culture and practice, I would say. So Rennie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and it's so interesting to hear everyone else. In my 5 minutes, I'd like to talk about 3 things. I'd like to talk about the role of the board. I'd like to talk about why and how we move to unrestricted funding and monitoring its effectiveness. So first, a reminder of the role of the board. And I'm sorry if I'm teaching grandmothers to suck eggs here, but the role of the board has 3 things it has to do. Strategy. It has to determine the strategic direction of the organization. Performance oversight. Are we delivering our strategy and how are we doing? And governance. Are we doing the right things in the right way at the right time? So the task is to be able to fly at 30,000 feet and to know when to drop down to 20,000 feet, 10,000 feet, and where to land and walk about. Unrestricted funding for us started some years ago, long before COVID, when as part of a strategy day, we re-examined our purpose. And we also, as part of that, considered our approach to risk. We agreed our purpose was to support small and medium-sized local charities who in turn help people overcome complex social issues. For example, homelessness, domestic abuse, trafficking, modern slavery, refugees, and so on. We concluded our job was to support the charities, and it was their job to make a difference. It was their job to make a difference to the people they're there to serve. They are the experts on how to do this, not us. We concluded we needed to be open to taking more risks. And I know that worries people when you say open to risks, but you have to think about them, and sometimes you just have to take some. So we used what I think of as our listening ladder to see what more we could do. Now, we're quite a big charity. We typically give grants to anything between 18 million and 20+ million every year, so a lot of money. We have regional managers throughout England and in Wales. Our regional managers listen to the charities we support, some 700 of them in England and Wales, and they support and listen to charities who want to apply for grants. So my listening ladder goes on. The senior leadership team listen to the regional managers and scope and propose new ways for us to make a difference. And as trustees, we listen to the senior leadership team and develop new strategies. So unrestricted funding and multi-year funding, it came about through listening and a willingness to take a risk. We don't seek a halo effect based on how many people's lives we have changed as a result of us, because that feels like a very false thing. If a charity has grants from many different people, we can't all claim that all the numbers of people that they've helped are us, just us. It's all of us, and of course it's them. We simply say we've done our due diligence and we back you, the charity, to do what you do best. We build relationships and capacity in this way, and that's how we make a difference. We monitor the effectiveness of this approach and listen to the feedback. It works for us. It works for our funders, Lloyds Banking Group. It works for the charities, and it works for those they support. One final thing, in seeking information that we need for our own governance, we discarded our bespoke list. I think Edmund talked about it quite powerfully earlier. We discarded our bespoke list of information that we then required. And we asked the question, what information do you gather for your own board, your own trustees? And we start there. We say, whatever you gather for them, that's what we start with. And if there's one or two other bits of essential information, we add it in. And quite often they say, that's helpful, we'll give that to our board as well, which is a good thing. It works. So additional message from me is that our strategy, our values, our purpose must be linked together and in working order. It's not a disconnected list in an annual report. They map our intentions, they guide our actions, and we can hold ourselves to account in this way. And two of our values, partnering, that's listening and working together, and ambitious, we're not afraid to take a stand and push for change, were very much used in us moving into this new way of working. But it's a really effective way of working, and I recommend it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rennie, very much. As with our other three speakers, you've raised some incredibly important points. And I think beginning with purpose and thinking of then to pick up Sufina's question about how best to add value, but we'll segue into the questions maybe with a quote from what you've just said. Our job is to support charities and their job is to make a difference. So that does sound like you're stating the bleeding obvious, but I think that is not the norm. And that's, I think, confirmed by our other speakers. Do you want to all come back, turn your videos back on, speakers, and come off mute? And we've got some I've just been handed a note saying we've got some good questions to feed in. So we're going to do that. I want to start with one that we actually got sent by somebody who couldn't attend but was keen to pick up on. And I think it kind of links between something Edmund was talking about and something Sufina was mentioning, in terms of Sufina, about the extent to which people really believe that funding is going to be core and there's no kind of hidden hurdle that they're going to need to get through. But Edmund, perhaps we can start with you. What could help more charities ask for unrestricted funding instead of always expecting restricted project grants? And I guess that's not just about what the funder can do, but are there things that charities themselves can do, even accepting that most of the power does not lie in their hands?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is a difficult one. I think, personally, I think that funders just need to go through the guidance a bit more in terms of being more specific with their guidance notes in terms of any applications made from applicants such as myself. And I would say that if they could recognize the main difference between a smaller grassroots organization like myself versus the big, large charities, because I think that will pave the way for going forward for small organizations like myself, because it's not, it's just really not fair for us to be competing with them. So if funders are able to distinguish that in their guidance in the first place, then, I feel that I have a chance at least, because because I'm doing all of this off my own back. And, and large charities have fundraising teams, don't they? Departments where they are paid a salary. So if more funders could recognize that from our perspective, then that obviously helps and that will be seen through their guidance when we try to apply for funding. And that's, you know,
Makes sense.
regardless, yeah, of unrestricted funding or just general funding applications.
Thanks, Edmund. Sufina, I mean, you clearly, you know, Ellerman has been on a journey around, particularly, I think, the kind of clarity of what you fund, what you're interested in, and yet you're saying that people still don't quite believe that there's a kind of element of kind of doubt or skepticism or anxiety on behalf of applicants. What's your sense of what more can be done?
So obviously it's not all of our applicants. There are people who return to us or who know us well and have confidence in who we are and how we fund. But I think for those that perhaps are less used to seeing a funder offer core as their kind of starting point rather than as an add-on, because I think that happens. And I think in some funders you see that they offer core on certain programs, but not on all of the programs and so on and so forth. So this is our default core funding. It can feel a bit kind of, is this too good to be true? And so I think the role for funders is to really query what our defaults are and why. And so we are very confident and clear about why we are a core funder primarily. And I think that conversation has also led us to think about, well, in actual fact, are we now on a journey towards becoming an unrestricted funder primarily? And I think as long as you are always looking back on what your default position is and why, and I think Rachel, you explained that really well in your presentation slides, of that kind of moment of clarifying what your default position is allows you to then determine whether it's the right one or not. And it doesn't mean that you then stop, you just have to keep evolving that. So I think there is something for all of us as funders to do to review why we offer what we do. And if it's, you know, capital funding, there'll be good reasons to carry on doing exactly that, but making sure that we're as flexible as we can be within being a capital funder. If it's core funding, carry on doing exactly that, or push yourselves further to do more and to do better. So that's, yeah, I think we've all got work to do, and we need to be listening to our grantees. And I think that, you know, colleagues like yourselves at IVAR are good kind of brokers for that challenge that needs to happen, because it is hard to be that lone voice on the other side applying for funds saying this is rubbish. So yeah, if there's roles for colleagues like IVAR, I would say.
Thanks, Sufina. Rennie, I think you want to come in, and then I think we'll take another question.
Okay, just very briefly, we sort of moved stepping stone towards unrestricted funding, because anyone we were giving funding to, we also offered something we called the enhanced program, which is to say, in addition to the money you're getting, there are a whole lot of other things you're able to ask us for. So if you need a piece of equipment, digital equipment, or if you need someone to go on a training course, or if you'd like us to run a seminar on this or that, we're happy to give you that in addition. So we wanted to enhance our offer by being open to requests for extra help. If you want leadership training for a newly appointed senior manager, we'll pay for that. And I think that helped the relationship between the charities we support and us when we came to do unrestricted funding, because they were, they knew we had a whole range of offers that they could just help themselves to if it was appropriate. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rennie. Kiva from IVAR, have you got some questions? Hi, Kiva.
Hi.
Hello, this is Kiva from IVAR, who works on the research. And I think Kiva, you've been monitoring the Q&A. You're going to throw us some interesting questions.
There has been a lot of interesting questions coming through. Just to start off, we've had a couple of questions on language, particularly the use of the word grantees as opposed to, say, charity partners, and whether what implication that has in terms of power imbalance. And we also had a question around referring to charities, and if that's just referring to registered charities or the full spectrum of organisations in receipt of funding.
Who would like to say anything about that? Sufina, are you?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond briefly. I think with language, intention matters, and I think we need to understand the ancestry of language. And so I think we do need to kind of challenge ourselves to think differently about the language that we use, particularly if the intention behind it has been to reinforce the power dynamic. And I think that sometimes it's shorthand and the intention is not cruel or to be reasserting the power dynamic, but at the same time, where that is being queried and questioned, we need to start thinking about what we do say. And so, organizations that we fund is a language that we use at Ellerman, and I always used to chuckle about the fact that when I wrote City Bridge Trust Strategy, Bridging Divides, I never once used the word grantee, and that was deliberately so. So I think language does matter. We have to think about the intention behind the language that we use. I don't think we should just always fall back on the excuse that it's shorthand, and I think we need to understand the ancestry or the genesis of the language that we're using. Gosh, and now I've forgotten the second part of the question.
Don't worry, we'll come on to it if anyone wants to pick it up. But do anyone else want to say anything about the grantees, or should we move on? Should we take another question? I should just say on the charities point, I mean, we're a research organisation and have spent 21 years agonising over what we call the organisations that we are set up to support. And if you go on our website, you'll see how we are using it as a sort of slightly cheeky catch-all. But that was partly about word count. But I think it's I think the power thing is perhaps rests more with the use of grantees. Kiva.
Thanks, Ben. So we've also had a couple of questions around impact. So one is it the fear of lack of measurable impact which stops funders giving unrestricted funding? Which is quite a juicy question. And we've also had another one. I'd be keen to know how the funders fulfill the requirement to report on the impact of their unrestricted funding, along with how they address the challenges of attribution and contribution.
Well, yes, I mean, I suspect we're going to need another bit of research and another webinar on this, but go to Rennie. Do you want to say a little bit about how, open up some of the points you made in your presentation about that?
Yeah, I think that the fulfilling the requirement thing, that unrestricted funding is about backing an organization in a sustainable way. So you know that you're in. Why we have multi-year grants is it's going to take a while for some of the things they're trying to do to get traction if they're trying to do new things and deliver. So we want to know, is the Board of Trustees sound? Does it have a sound strategy moving forward? Is it financially sound, and so on? But we don't want to dig the carrots up just after we planted them to see if they're growing. We want to trust that they know how to do the gardening, and we'll back them.
I'd like to really say, I'm very happy to hear that, isn't it, coming from from Rennie there, saying that, again, she was talking about sustainability, right? So we all want to sustain the projects, especially after we've been funded, but she's actually recognized that obviously that would incur more funding. So multi-year funding is obviously very useful for small grassroots organizations. And also I'd like to mention is how many people have gone through the application. And one of the questions is, when they basically apply for a direct project cost, how many applications have the word sustainability? So how is your project going to be sustainable after the funding has ended? So there you go. It's like, well, you only want to fund us for a direct project cost, but then you ask us how is the project going to be sustained after that funding has ended? So, how do you answer that question? So again, I think it comes down to the particular funder and their understanding of how we as an organization need to be sustainable. So then therefore we can sustain the people we're trying to help.
Thanks, Edmund. Rachel, do you want to have another go?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just in terms of the difference, we just focus on looking at the organisational goals and to see the difference the organisation has made. We ask them for reports they're producing anyway, so we're not interested in how our funding, and in a way that's what we report on. And again, I think we've got a lot to learn, but the first year was really good, particularly not expecting them to produce anything that they weren't producing already, and including Zoom meetings, phone calls. We ask them to us rather than the other way around.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I mean, I think that we've long here at IVAR been slightly concerned about the idea that funders are best placed to be auditors of social progress rather than the organisations who are actually carrying out the work. And I think if you make the leap and you negotiate the challenges around risk and you embrace trust in the way that we're talking about here, then you have to then let go of something if your system is going to be aligned in the way that Rennie described. We had a question in the chat, Kiva, if that's okay, I just want to pick up, that came from Paula at Community Foundation Northern Ireland, which is something that we've been hearing quite a lot during discussions around open and trusting, which is that an anxiety around becoming more flexible and opening yourselves up for unrestricted funding is that you are going to be swamped with applications because, of course, unrestricted funding, there's a reason why we call the research the holy grail of funding. And managing increased demand with a restricted budget is going to put huge pressure on the system. And historically, of course, I think what we've seen is that funders have tightened criteria and overloaded due diligence at that point to manage the stress and pressure of that, the clash between demand and budget. I wondered if you've got any thoughts about that as a barrier to unrestricted. Any of you would like to come in? Rennie, do you want to have a go?
Yes. Something that came to me while you were talking was how we approached Black-led charities. What we did was look at how many people were we supporting charities that affected different diverse communities. And we said we were, but then we went a bit deeper and said, how many of them are Black-led? Well, no. So had they applied? Yes. Where did they drop out? And then we discovered both in Wales and in Black-led charities, many of the charities started focusing on one thing and then spread to do more general things. And we had a rule that said, you have to do 50% of your work has to be one of our key things that we support, like homelessness, refugees, and so on that I mentioned earlier. But that disproportionately affected these charities in Wales because of the rurality and other things. They tended to spread and do more over time. And so we had to go back and look at our own rules and change our rules and open them up for these charities. So we were proportionate about what we opened up, and we looked carefully at how we were letting people know we were open. And then, of course, because we have staff to do it, we have regional managers who talk to people before they put their grant application in and help them and let them know whether or not they're likely to be suitable, so they don't put a lot of energy and work in for an application that they're not doing the sorts of things that we're supporting. So being more careful at the beginning and then opening up and changing our rules if it allows more people in, and understanding diversity means having a diversity of approach in the way that Edmund has described, with very much smaller charities and big charities. I think that makes a difference.
Thanks, Rennie. I don't know if Sufina or Rachel, you want to come in on this tension between the increased demand through being more flexible and limited budgets. Sufina.
I think the reality is that there's increased demand, full stop. It doesn't matter if you're doing project funding, capital funding, core or unrestricted, or any others that I haven't thought about. So I think that it's almost a non-argument now. And so my thinking is that funders do need to apply definition to what we're looking to fund, because that is where our expertise is. That is where, you know, at Ellerman, we talk about ourselves as being specialists in generalism in our 3 areas. And so, but we know what we're good at. We know what we can fund well, what we can offer good support to our, you know, eventual organisations that we fund. And so we need some criteria. Some of the time we put in criteria because of our capacity issues as well as capability issues. And we need to be more open about that, so that those applying to us are clear about why it might be that we're looking to support a registered charity and not a another kind of charitable form of organisation. But equally, we're very much open to being challenged on that, because sometimes what we do is we apply certain kind of basic criteria across all 3 of our areas. And we've recently been realising that for one of our areas, having this kind of specification of a UK registered charity only doesn't really work for the kind of thing that we want to fund. So we will go away, think about that, and come back with solutions. So I think it's almost, yeah, it's a non-argument. The demand for independent or similar forms of grant funding is super high, and we need to be really clear about why we have criteria in place. We need to be transparent about that, and we need to stick to it in a way that is transparent, but also, no one wants to see a grants list thinking, how the hell did that organisation get funding? Who do they know? So as long as we're not doing any of those shenanigans too, then yeah, I think as long as we're sticking to our guidelines and our principles and operating with transparency, all to the good.
Thanks, Sufina. I mean, I think that does also, it links to a couple of questions we've just seen in the chat around feedback. We're doing some research on that as part of the open and trusting work, and also applications and assessments. And I do think that what we're hearing is the kind of clarity of purpose upstream is incredibly important, but also it's not fair. You know, grant making is not a science. It's a form of, it's a series of informed judgments. And I think the transparency around what underpins those judgments is important to people. There's some interesting feedback in a recent blog that we published around that there is appreciation for the foundations making a bit more of their thinking visible about their decision making. We've got time, Kiva, for I think another 1, maybe 2 if they're quick.
We've had a couple of questions around relationship building, in particular if you have any comments or advice on how to build a lasting relationship with a funder.
Edmund, do you want any thoughts on that? And then we might ask one of the funders if they've got something.
Yeah, so I think relationship again would come through multi-year funding for me. So, you know, if you really believe in what we do and who we're trying to help, then, you know, fund us more than just for 3 to 6 months, you know, where we're going to have to stop the project and then look for funding again to restart the project. So for me, you know, if those funders out there who really want to build relationships with us, with smaller, with what we would call it grantees, then by offering multi-year funding, I think everybody wins, you know, in terms of like, we get to sustain the project. You talk about sustainability all the time. So, you know, if you fund us over a few years, we're going to, you know, it's going to happen, isn't it? The project will tick all your boxes in that sense. But again, obviously this webinar is about unrestricted funding. So that's where, again, if we do have projects that we can't get refunded for, then the unrestricted funding would obviously help sustain those projects who are just for funders who just look at direct project costs.
Yes, I mean, the situation, short-term funding, where you might want to say back to a funder that you're going to spend half their funding applying to someone else for additional funding is a perverse situation I think we want to avoid. Should we take one more question, Kiva, and then we're going to have to...
I can do a short one to end on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to founders of new charities in relation to approaching unrestricted funding?
Anyone got a sparkling thought there?
For new charities, I think that's going to be very difficult, but it comes around to the whole point of this webinar, and obviously why we're meeting together, is that we are trying to build a relationship, an open and trusting relationship between the funders and fundees, grantees, whatever you want to be called. And that obviously means new and older charitable organisations.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask each of our speakers for a quick takeaway from the conversation today and your various histories in and around unrestricted funding. And we're going to go in the order you spoke, if that's okay. Edmund, can I just come to you? And we're going to need to keep these kind of to a sentence, I think.
I have to think about this couple of sentences. I think it would be very pleasing from a smaller grassroots organisation that funders do look at our point of view in terms of what we have to go through to get the funding. I think that is the main thing I want to finish on, really, because that would just help.
Thanks, Edmund. A bit of empathy in the system, I think.
Yes, please.
Rachel.
Really, this is a message for small funders. We've been surprised has reduced risk rather than increased it.
Thanks. I think we caught the crucial bit there, which is that it's actually helped reduce risk rather than, I think, what the kind of received wisdom is the other way around. So thank you, Rachel. Sufina.
So my kind of closing thoughts are that we are part of a very diverse, non-homogeneous funding ecology, and we need to think about the way in which we operate and complement what we're doing and in service of those that we seek to fund. And so there is definitely a need to engage in dialogue in a way that maybe requires honest, useful brokers like IVAR to really help challenge us into thinking in ways that are helpful and as effective as we claim we want to be. And I think that there's definitely a need to make transparent what may seem very opaque about grant makers and the way that they operate. So, you know, why we might have certain guidelines in place, and it could be because of our staffing capacity as well as our capabilities, and how can we make those things more transparent?
Thank you, Sufina. And Rennie.
The word I'd want to leave on is commit. First, you decide you're going to do it. Commit. Then you decide how you're going to do it. If you try to do both at the same time, you water it down and you never quite get round to it. So commit.
Thank you, Rennie. Well, I think I can say we and our trustees at IVAR are deeply committed to continuing this, and I think trying to build momentum towards a new mindset. My takeaway is actually from you, Rennie, which is a quote. Well, actually, I'm going to link it to Sufina's question. How best to add value, I think, is a question of foundations. If they start with that, if that's the exam question, I'm pretty sure it's not short-term restricted project funding. Our job is to support charities. Their job is to make a difference. I want to thank you all very much for coming today. I want to thank Edmund, Rennie, and Sufina, and Rachel particularly, for sharing their thoughts, and for the three of you for again contributing to the report. For any funders out there, we'd love you to join the open and trusting grant making community. There's always spaces available. There's about 90 of you so far, but we're trying to build a long-term movement for change. So let us know if you'd like to talk about that. If you're a charity, we have some advice on our website about thinking about unrestricted funding. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, please do that. And that's it. Go well, get to Christmas safely, have a good break, and let's make 2022 the year that we really break through with this. Thank you again. Great to see you.